Thanks, Amy. We're going to spend a bit of time in that passage this morning. We are continuing through John, looking at different parts, particularly focused in this section that is, we've called it One Last Night. It's the section of John that is really the night before Jesus dies. And we're following along. Jesus and the disciples are in the upper room, and this is kind of his last kind of communication with them before he heads towards the cross. So we'll spend a bit of time thinking about that. I don't know, you're probably aware, but this weekend, Friday, was the start of World Pride that's launched in Sydney. If you don't know, it's a thing that kind of happens every 2 to 3 years somewhere in the world, different, like things like the Olympics. Cities put their bid in to host it, and Sydney is hosting it this year. And it's a strange space and a difficult space often to work in, particularly with Christianity. On one hand, there's a lot of things that that the Bible disagrees with attached with that. And on another hand, there's some terrible history of the way the church has handled some of those things that is quite embarrassing and things that the church shouldn't have done. And so we are in this space where both those things are true, and trying to work out how to navigate that space can be difficult. It feels a little bit like we're surrounded by a number of issues like that at the moment. I don't know how you feel in your space and world that you live and operate in, but things like the progressive woke movement, things like that, feel like there's a, I know some of you in schools, in roles with children, trying to work out what some of this will look like. It feels like a little bit like this tide that's coming in, maybe even like a tidal wave that's going to inevitably crash down, and lots of questions over how we handle things like that. It's not just in that space. I mean, as I studied the last 2 years, the more I felt like I dug into kind of arguments against Christianity, the more I recognise those arguments are complex. And just as much as there's a group of Christians that want to prove the Bible is true, there's a group that aggressively want to disprove the Bible. That's true when you look at things like field of archaeology. There's Christians that are so eager to prove things archaeologically true that they overreach and they make claims about things that are too much assertions that are not helpful. But just as much as that's happening, there's another group that are going to overreach the other way and try to find anything that might be a hint of disproof of the Bible and lean into that space. The same thing's true as we think of other atheistic kind of movements, the space of science, this antagonistic kind of approach to science that's just trying to find any way to disprove the Bible. Some of these things just feel like, I mean, they're not new, but they feel like, I don't know if you feel it, but feel like at times there's just this push that is just unrelenting, and it can be quite exhausting. I know I just commenced in my role officially this week, but it makes me look forward to retirement. I mean, I know it's early days, and I'm not saying I don't want to work or something like that, and I'm not saying I don't love ministry, I do. I like the idea of feeling like getting to a place of an end of achievement and say, I want to be in a place, I'd love to get to a place where I can say I've run my race well and I've faced these things well, and it feels like that's still lots of things to come, lots of questions. And it's not just questions over how these things impact us. It's questions on how we engage with these spaces. And as we come to this discussion with the disciples, the night before Jesus dies, there's this huge tension that's going on, and it's a tension not just on what might happen to them, but it's a tension on what they might do as they engage in that. That's what's going on in this scene as Jesus speaks to his disciples. The disciples have reason to be concerned about what's coming. I mean, tension has been rising. As you read through the Gospels and the story of Jesus, you can see this tension rise between Jesus and particularly the religious leaders. If you follow John's story, the way he tells it, a significant point is actually the raising of Lazarus from the dead. At that point, it seems like the religious leaders really draw a line in the sand and they go, enough is enough. Like, this guy is getting too many followers. What he's doing is too oppositional. We got to put a stop to it. And John tells us it's at that point they say, time for Jesus to die. Not only that, as Lazarus walks around, the new raised to life guy, he is a testament to Jesus' ministry. And so John tells us a short while later, the religious leaders say, also, Lazarus should die. And you've got to feel for Lazarus at that point. I mean, he's already done it once, just came back to life, and a whole bunch of guys are already trying to finish him off. The disciples are in that same space. This is the kind of aggressive opposition they face. And then we get this picture of Jesus coming into Jerusalem, and it's not like flying in under the radar, right? The triumphant entry is a huge celebration. People are shouting and screaming that Jesus is the king that's arrived. So it's got to be twofold for the disciples. Excitement, people are getting on board with this, and also we aren't able to make a quiet entrance into Jerusalem this year. Everyone knows we're here. The religious leaders don't want us here, and the tension has reached a pinnacle. They are in this kind of closed room upstairs. If the tension is not already high enough, Jesus then starts saying silly things like, he's going to die. Like, if they're not already concerned that's going to happen, the guy they're following is telling them that's going to happen. And if that's not enough, the guy that amongst them seems like the boldest of them all, Peter, when he steps up to Jesus and says, I'm going to follow you to the grave, no way am I going to step down, Jesus says, actually, Peter, you will deny me 3 times. You've got to imagine, disciples looking in on that scene. I mean, Peter's the guy that shows up to the Garden of Gethsemane strapped with a sword, right? He's the guy in the disciples that you think if one of us was going to kind of hold fast in the tension, he's the guy. And Jesus said, no, even Peter will fall away. Tension is high, fear is high, not just what's going to happen to them, but how they're going to respond to that. In fact, that is the main context of this section. The very verse before what we read, where Jesus says, don't be troubled, the very verse before that is Jesus saying to Peter, you will deny me 3 times. You almost feel the silence in the room when Jesus says, Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times. Something happens in that moment that Jesus goes, these guys need some comfort in this moment. And his next sentence is, don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me. And Jesus spends this next little time giving comfort to his disciples in this tension. He says, in my Father's house are many rooms. It's quite interesting that Jesus uses this phrase, Father's house. It's not a common phrase. The only other time John says that Jesus says those words, Father's house, is right at the very beginning of his ministry, where he clears the temple. You might remember the story. Jesus goes in the temple, chases the people that are selling stuff in the temple out, and he says, you've made my Father's house a den of thieves. And he chases them out. So Jesus uses this phrase, Father's house, to talk about the temple. Here he doesn't seem to be talking about the temple. I mean, first of all, he says it has many rooms. It seems something different. It's likely he's talking about heaven, but that's not the disciples' language of heaven. The Jews would use language more like Zion or Jerusalem as a description of a new heaven, a new hope. The significance of Jesus using this phrase of his Father's house is a message about God's presence. That is what the picture of the temple was for God's people, the place where God's Spirit dwelled amongst his people. So what Jesus is saying here is, this isn't just a lofty thing that we want to talk about. He's saying there is a place for you in God's presence. He says it has many rooms. Present tense. It has many rooms. Those rooms are there. There's space for many people. And then he says, I'm going there to prepare a place for you. What does that mean, that Jesus is going to prepare a place for them? I mean, it has many rooms, like that's already there. But Jesus says, I'm going to prepare a place, and that place is for you. Jesus is saying, there will be a home for you with the Father. The point here is that this is not our home. That Jesus is saying there is a home. Your home is with the Father. It makes significant difference when we think about where our home is and what we're doing in this life if this is not our home. I remember years ago, when I was in high school, I climbed Mount Wilhelm in Papua New Guinea. So Mount Wilhelm is the tallest mountain in New Guinea. It's 4,700 metres above sea level. It's twice, just under twice anything that's in Australia. To be fair, it's not like we hiked up from sea level to the top. In fact, my father is a pilot, so we kind of cheated, and he flew his plane to just shy of base camp, parked it there on the runway, just like, parking the bus, and we hopped out and we hiked up to base camp. I remember the night sleeping at base camp before we hiked, and someone had built this wooden shelter to sleep in for the hike. That way you don't have to carry tents and stuff like that. You go into this wooden shelter. It's high altitude, so it's quite cold. And there's a whole bunch of guys, and the bed was just this big timber, and it was made of logs. Like, it wasn't a flat piece of timber, it was just logs lying side by side. And I remember we packed in there. There wasn't a huge issue with cold because we were so packed in. We were so packed in, my memory of it is when one person rolled, everyone had to roll. Like, it was like, and it was not pleasant. I mean, you were looking forward to the hike because you just were like, I just need to get out of this space. Now, there's something there, right? You go through something like that because you're doing it for a purpose. There's a task at hand. And the other part of you is you just have to keep telling yourself this is, a temporary thing. This is not the place that I'm building a comfortable life. I'm here for a purpose. And that's a similar concept when we think about the idea of this home is not our home and there is a heavenly home. That is the place where there is comfort, and this is the place where we are here for a purpose. And that is part of the message Jesus wants to say, that there is a place for us. But he also says he is preparing that place. What does it mean he's preparing a place for us? He actually uses a few phrases here. It kind of gives us this timeline that feels like it should help, but it feels like it's also confusing. You can understand why the disciples are confused what he's saying. He says, I'm going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, he says, I will also come back and I will take you to be with me. So what is the timeline of this preparing a place? What is happening there? We certainly see that there's a message that he's going to come back and take people to be with him. It seems like he's talking about more than just his resurrection and coming back to the disciples and then ascending to heaven. The taking to be with him seems to talk about something further down the track there. But the context of what he's talking about right here in going is the cross. This whole conversation in the room with the disciples, he is saying, I'm going, I'm going, I'm going. I'm only going to be with you a little while and then I'm going. This is all talking about what is happening the next day in the cross. So when Jesus is talking about, I'm going to prepare a place, it seems more than just kind of he's up in heaven, he's a carpenter's son. He's not just up in heaven building rooms and building mansions for people in heaven. There's something happening more immediately than that. The preparing that Jesus is doing is the cross, death, resurrection, and ascension. All of that is what is happening here when Jesus says he is preparing a place for you. This is not just, Jesus is not up in heaven making beds, preparing for the guests to arrive. Right? He made the bed. It was his deathbed was the bed that he made. He's not just putting out towels for us to use. No, he's done the washing clean in his sacrifice on the cross. Jesus makes access to this place with God possible. That's what the preparing is. He's making it possible by preparing. But he also tells us that he's making a way to get there. In fact, that's his words. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father through me, but through me. The hope here, the comfort here, is that Jesus is the way. And that can be a comfort as we think about how we might face opposition in this world, how we might engage with people in this life. There's a great fear, when you're talking with someone that you'll say the wrong thing or that, you'll misrepresent Jesus. There is a comfort to remember that Jesus is the way, we are not the way, and we point people to Jesus. We point to him as the way. And while we're not always going to do even that perfectly all the time, and we know that we will fail, there is something incredibly comforting to know that he is the one that is drawing people to him because he is the way, the truth, and the life. That is the comfort. It's also a helpful reminder, I think, for us to not get distracted by the other social, political things that are going on. It's easy for us sometimes to focus on things around us, lifestyle decisions maybe, different views on morality, different views on the world. It's easy for us to kind of get distracted by those things, particularly the extreme views, and lose sight of the fact that the core issue at hand is actually alienation from God. The core issue at hand is people are far from God. And that means that the person who is aggressively out here proclaiming anti-Christian concepts has just a bigger problem with alienation from God as our neighbour who lives in a traditional household, traditional family, but also isn't following Jesus. If Jesus is the way, then it's a great reminder that that is the core issue at hand. This is what Don Carson says when he's talking about people that are really overly focused on small kind of peripheral issues that oppose Christianity. He says this, from a biblical theological perspective, these challenges, those things that he's talking about, as serious as they are reflections of the still deeper problem, our alienation from God. If we tackle these problems without tackling what is central, we are merely playing around with the symptoms. We see a real clear image of that in the way Jesus deals with the story of the adulterous woman, and a whole group of people are about to stone this woman for she's been caught in adultery, and Jesus takes an alternate view. His approach is more of compassion than condemnation, because the main issue here is actually relationship with him than it is with lifestyle. Not to say, as Carson says, those things are still serious, but we want to be careful not to be distracted from the main thing. And we want to be a church here that is accepting and loving of all people. That doesn't mean we need to accept and love everyone's personal values and things that they choose is right. And it means we still want to stick to what the Bible says is true, and God be the governor of what is right and wrong. But yet we want to remember all people are made in the image of God, and all people are worthy of being treated with respect and dignity. And that is something we want to be as a church. And be careful that we're not distracted from that main thing, that Jesus is the way. He prepared the way, and we want to point people to him. As we think about that idea and we think about heaven as a home, there's still a real question about what now? What's the comfort now? And you feel some of that for the disciples in that moment. In fact, if you follow the questioning that the disciples have in that upper room, There's a number of questions. They just kind of keep drilling Jesus about trying to solve the question, where is he going? What is happening? We didn't read this one, we read this last week, but Peter asked 2 questions. He says to Jesus, where are you going? I mean, he asked him directly. Jesus says, where I'm going, you can't follow. Hardly feels like he answered the question. So Peter says, why can't I follow? And Jesus says, just heads up, you're going to deny me 3 times. I mean, it feels like, from the sake of the disciples, Peter's trying to get the answers, and then he gets the biggest smackdown of all. Poor guy. Thomas goes in a little bit more timidly. He says, when Jesus says, you know the way to where I'm going, Thomas, he's echoing Peter's sentiment. He goes, we don't even know where you're going. How can we know the way? We get to Philip, ask this question. You can feel, I think, some level of desperation from these guys. Just the feeling like this is so heavy for them. Philip just says, Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. Philip cuts through all those questions, and his question just seems to be, I just want a revelation of God that is going to hold me true in all this. And Jesus' answer is that he is the revelation of God. This is what he said. Don't you believe that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me? The words I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. Jesus' point here is that he is the revelation from God. In fact, as we look through the whole of the Bible, we see that God is progressively revealing himself through the Bible. And, it's not that God changes as we read through the Bible, but we see different sides of God from Genesis 1 to what we see by the end of the Old Testament. There's this progressive revealing. But one of the greatest revelations of who God is in the person of Jesus. It is God who came near, literally, to be with people. That is one of the greatest revelations of God. I was joking with some people yesterday at Miles's ordination. At Miles's ordination, he received a Bible, and at the deacon's ordination, they only hand them a New Testament, right? Whereas I was ordained a month ago, and they gave me the whole Bible. The joke is, I now have the authority to actually read the Old Testament, and Miles still has some ways to go before he gets to such a privilege. That, of course, is not true. One of the things we want to say is that there's such an incredible revelation of God and the way that is made to God in the New Testament through Jesus, that is something we want to hold strongly to. We want to make sure that's something central to all we do. And so that's definitely true. But also, and this is not why deacons are handed just a New Testament, our diocese does believe the whole Bible is valuable and good for all people to read, but the whole Bible gives us this picture. I've heard it said that when you just read the New Testament, you do get a picture of God and you see a way to God, but in some ways that picture is in black and white. It gives you the clear answers, but it's black and white. When you read the whole Bible, you get God's message of salvation in full colour, and you see all the elements to it. And so as we read through the Old Testament, we see a clear picture of people who have moved away from God, that God is holy and people have rejected him and moved away from God. In the Gospels, we see Jesus who shows us the way to God, that God came near and made a way through his own death. And as we read the epistles, the letters to the churches, we see more about how to live God's way and what that looks like for us. Jesus is that revelation of God. And one of the comforting things we can read here is that getting to know more of Jesus is bringing God's comfort into our own lives. That when we seek to know God more, there is a promise there that we are comforted in him in that. And so we want to explore more, know Jesus more, not just know more about Jesus, but also to know Jesus in a personal way. And God offers this promise that there is comfort in that as we get to know Jesus, we are knowing God and we receive the comfort of God. That is comfort for us. One last thing I want to say is that the comfort that God is still at work. You can imagine the disciples asking that question through the whole incident that happens from the night before Jesus dies through to his resurrection. They're asking the question, where is God in all this? It seems like he's not at work. But the answer is God is at work. And Jesus gives the disciples this incredible promise. Let me read it to you again. This is what he says, verse 12. Very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father. What a crazy idea, that God's people will do greater things than Jesus is already doing. I mean, you look at Jesus' ministry and you think, that's how could that be? But as we follow the story of the disciples, it becomes clear that God does use them in ways in their ministry that Jesus didn't even see in his earthly ministry. For example, Peter, at Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit is poured out on him, he preaches, and we read in Acts that 3,000 people are added to their number that day. I mean, Jesus has crowds following him, but it doesn't seem like Jesus kind of has those kinds of numbers of people that actually get it and actually click. God does something powerfully through the Holy Spirit in Peter, where people aren't just following him because of the miracles that he's doing, but actually we're seeing transformation in people to put their faith in God. We see it in Paul's ministry. I mean, Jesus plants 0 churches in his time. I mean, arguably he plants the church in Jerusalem with the disciples, but really he empowers the leaders who then plant the churches. But the early disciples, Paul, I mean, it's hard to know how many churches Paul planted. At least in 14 cities, Paul has had churches started. Might be multiple churches in those cities. There might have been other churches that were planted along the way. But at least 14 churches Paul planted. God used his disciples in the early church in powerful ways. But even beyond that, we see, as we look throughout history, that the message of Christianity has gone from a small group of guys, 11 guys with Jesus, huddled in this room, fearful of what the future holds. That group has grown to a global movement of Jesus followers. It's helpful for us to be reminded of that it can feel like Christianity is going backwards. And certainly in the West, we have a whole era where people became Christian in name only and not really followers of Jesus. And that has come out really clearly. And so where the numbers of Christians are dropping, and it's possible that actually the number of people who are genuine followers of Jesus isn't dropping. One of the phenomena we see in our census in Australia is that the number of people who write Christian on the census is decreasing rapidly each census. But actually the number of people who attend churches on a Sunday is increasing. You see what's happening there? The number of people that call themselves Christian and the number of people who are actively living out lives for Jesus, one is decreasing, the other is increasing. God is still growing his church. And it's true that there might be times and in places where we see the number of genuine Christians diminish. But what is clear from what Jesus says, and we've seen throughout history, is the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed. That's what Jesus describes it as. Starts small and grows into this huge tree. And that has continued to happen. And Jesus is promising that that would happen, that he would work powerfully through his people to see incredible things happen. We've seen that. We continue to see God's kingdom grow. These are things that we want to hang onto and find comfort in the midst of times where we feel like there's great opposition. and great conflict with us. We're going to spend some time in prayer, and some of that will be thinking about some of those things. And I'm going to invite Beth up, and she's going to lead us in that.